about this weird trend. I agree with you, I think it's weird, where we're being compelled to just apologise constantly for everything that happened in the past.
More and more countries are starting to apologise for their colonial past. With those excuses often come reparation payments to people whose ancestors suffered from this past. But is it even appropriate at all to apologise for this past, let alone pay for it? Douglas Murray has a strong opinion on slavery reparations and historical guilt.
That's right. It's a very strange act of masochism, really, and an act of masochism carried out by people who don't seem to know anything.
Douglas Murray, the best-selling author and conservative commentator, has stirred up controversy with his recent comments on slavery reparations. Murray calls the push for reparations a very strange act of masochism and questions the motives behind it. In his own words, he describes it as an act of masochism carried out by people who don't seem to know anything.
I mean, people talk about the British monarchy having to apologise for slavery. It was King George III who signed the Anti-Slavery Act into law in 1807.
Murray argues that much of the current discourse around slavery and reparations ignores historical facts. He points out that the British monarchy, often a target of these discussions, actually played a significant role in ending the slave trade. Murray cites King George III signing the Anti-Slavery Action Law in 1807 and Prince Albert's anti-slavery address in 1840 as examples. He elaborates, Prince Albert gave one of the most extraordinary anti-slavery addresses when the British was still policing the anti-slave trade on the high seas in 1840 to the Anti-Slavery League in London.
Gave one of the most extraordinary anti-slavery addresses when the British were still policing the anti-slave trade on the high seas in 1840 to the Anti-Slavery League.
Murray's point is clear that the historical record is more complex than many reparations advocates acknowledge. He suggests that this complexity negates the need for reparations and argues that constantly apologising for past wrongs is not only unnecessary but potentially harmful. Murray states, all of this was addressed 200 years ago, and today, unfortunately, there's a kind of new type of malcontent, and usually also a huckster to boot, who just decides that none of this happened. Usually it's because they don't know it happened.
All of this was addressed 200 years ago.
Douglas Murray has some provocative views on reparations and historical guilt. He calls the push for reparations an entirely self-destructive exercise. Murray argues that it's no longer about those who committed wrongs giving money to those who were wronged. Instead, he suggests it's become about people who look like people who did a wrong thing, paying those who resemble people who were wronged.
That this country, America, goes through that entirely self-destructive exercise.
He questions, I'm not quite sure where the apology tour ends. What's the end game? This reflects his skepticism about the ultimate goal of reparations advocates and suggests that he sees the movement as potentially lacking a clear, achievable objective.
Well, it's a kind of grievance competition.
In Murray's view, the current focus on reparations and historical apologies represents a form of grievance competition that he finds unproductive and potentially divisive. He argues that this approach ignores the progress that has been made and the complex realities of history, instead focusing on a simplified narrative of victimhood and guilt.
All of this was addressed 2 centuries ago. Everything has consequences.
Should countries be held accountable for historical wrongs committed centuries ago? Or should we focus more on addressing current issues and injustices?
You could do this to everyone and to everything, but most civilizations and cultures don't behave like this because most of them aren't just masochistic and so self-hating.
Not everyone agrees with this characterization. Paula Ron offers a different perspective on the importance of acknowledging historical wrongs. She argues that understanding the hurt and pain caused is crucial, not just focusing on the good things. Ron believes that saying sorry is empowering and necessary for healing and moving forward. Murray suggests that the constant focus on historical wrongs can be depressing and lead to a loss of pride in one's country. He argues that both the United Kingdom and the United States are 2 of the greatest countries in the world, and that there's a problematic trend of people queuing up to find a reason to hate the countries and their histories.
In terms of justice for all, I mean, I think we'd all agree that there should be justice.
Well, I'm not suffering from when the Normans invaded this country.
Agree.
I'm not suffering from what my ancestors went through.
Are modern-day apologies for historical wrongs merely symbolic? Or can they lead to meaningful change?
But part of the knowledge is also understanding the hurt and pain that were caused, not just about the good things. It's not just about the cherry picking.
Residual inequities that exist in American life, and that the consequences of slavery could be one of the factors that resulted from this.
He points out that America is diverse, with many people sharing skin color with historical slave owners, but having no connection to the slave trade. He also mentions ethnic MHO immigrated after slavery ended. Murray questions how these groups would fit into a reparations scheme.
It's only about racism. And they can't answer why Asians who've arrived more recently don't, for instance, get held down by white supremacy.
While acknowledging potential residual inequities in American life due to slavery, Murray argues it's not a simple, one-issue answer. He describes it as a multi-dimensional issue.
I agree with Douglas about the fact that we don't know enough. He's absolutely right. We don't know enough, and it's important that we do.
This raises questions about the nature of historical guilt and how long it should persist. Murray argues that the current focus on historical wrongs is counterproductive and questions what the end game of these apologies and calls for reparations is. How many generations should pass before a society can move on from its historical wrongs? Murray argues that if we're going to talk about historical wrongs, we need to look at the full global picture. He points out that many other cultures and countries engaged in slavery, often on a larger scale, but face little to no pressure for reparations.
All of the countries around the world that engaged in the slave trade who are simply not interested in any form of reparations, the Ottoman Empire.
Murray mentions the Ottoman Empire and Arab countries, which he claims traded more slaves than the transatlantic slave trade. He also notes the lack of interest in Africa for paying reparations for their role in selling fellow Africans into slavery. Importantly, Murray highlights that slavery still exists, with more slaves in the world now than at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. This raises the question of whether our focus on historical wrongs is distracting us from addressing ongoing injustices.
Ottoman Empire, all the Arab countries who not just traded far more slaves across the Atlantic, but castrated all the men so that there wouldn't be any more African slaves.
Is it fair to focus primarily on Western slavery when discussing historical wrongs and reparations? Murray argues that many claims of ongoing harm from historical slavery are disingenuous. He makes a provocative comparison to the Barbary slave trade, where North Africans enslaved 1 million Europeans, to illustrate the arbitrary nature of focusing on certain historical wrongs while ignoring others.
In paying reparations for selling their brother and sister Africans into slavery or for working them to the bone to the present day. There is slavery across Africa.
Critics argue that this ignores the specific, ongoing impacts of the transatlantic slave trade on modern societies. They contend that the effects of historical slavery continue to be felt today, particularly in terms of systemic inequalities. Should we prioritize addressing current-day slavery over seeking reparations for historical slavery? Murray makes a controversial claim that the countries often targeted for reparations are, in fact, the most desirable and morally advanced countries in the world. He points out that countries like Britain, America, and France are among the most desired destinations for migrants worldwide.
Today, in fact, there are more slaves in the world today than there were at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. So some of us are simply a bit bored of hearing people ripping at closed wounds and then crying about their hurt.
Murray argues that this desirability is not because these countries are racist, but because they're better and good. He claims that Western countries are more likely to recognize and call out racism as a sin. This argument suggests that the focus on historical wrongs ignores the positive aspects of Western societies and unfairly singles them out for criticism, despite being more progressive on issues of racism and equality than many other parts of the world.
Hurt, and nobody is alive who did the wrong. And I'd make one other point, if I may. It's always the countries that people want to come to.
However, Murray and his supporters push back against this characterization. They argue that the pain people claim to be suffering today from events 200 or 300 years ago is not real pain, as they're not the ones who directly suffered these historical wrongs. How do we balance acknowledging historical wrongs with focusing on current issues? Murray argues that if we follow the logic of historical reparations to its conclusion, we'd be endlessly apologising for increasingly distant historical wrongs. He questions where this process would end and suggests it's ultimately counterproductive. The debate over slavery reparations remains complex and contentious. Douglas Murray's views challenge us to critically examine how we address historical wrongs. What's your take? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. See you in the next one. Until then, bye.